For 1,500 years, this dome has refused to fall. It has survived earthquakes powerful enough to flatten cities, wars that erased empires, and centuries of constant change. Kings vanished, religions shifted, entire civilizations disappeared. Yet this single dome still hangs more than 50 meters above the floor, almost exactly where ancient builders placed it. The first people who stood beneath it struggled to believe what they were seeing. One writer claimed it did not rest on the building at all, but floated down from heaven on a golden chain. Looking up, it is easy to understand why. 40 windows pour light around its base until the enormous ceiling seems to lose its weight entirely, hovering high above the city like something that should not exist. But Hagia Sophia is not suspended by a miracle. It is suspended by mathematics, by courage, and by one engineering lesson that changed architectural history forever. Because here is the part almost nobody tells you. The first dome failed. It collapsed. And the building standing today exists only because ancient engineers were willing to admit they had been wrong. This is not simply the story of history's most famous dome. It is the story of how failure became one of the greatest engineering breakthroughs ever achieved. In the year 532, Constantinople was the richest city on earth. It was the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, overflowing with wealth, trade, and political power. Then, almost overnight, it nearly burned to the ground. A violent uprising known as the Nika Revolt swept through the streets, and when the fires died down, much of the city lay in ashes. Among the ruins was the empire's greatest church. For Emperor Justinian, simply rebuilding it was not enough. He wanted something the world had never seen. Not just the largest church, the most breathtaking building ever created. A monument that would prove his empire was the true heir of Rome itself. Most rulers would have summoned master builders. Justinian made a far stranger choice. He chose two mathematicians, Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus. Neither was famous for raising monumental buildings. They were experts in geometry, in mechanics, in the mathematics of curves and forces. That single decision would change architecture forever. The emperor handed them an impossible challenge. Build an enormous circular dome. Place it above a vast square hall. Remove the forest of columns earlier churches had always needed, and make the entire ceiling appear to float. There was just one problem. A dome is a circle, a hall is a square, and for centuries, builders had been defeated by that simple contradiction. Rest a heavy round dome directly on four arches, and gaping holes are left at the corners. The forces pull in different directions. Sooner or later, something tears apart. For generations, that problem stopped architects from ever creating a truly open interior. But Anthemius and Isidore believed geometry itself could become the answer. What they were about to invent inside Hagia Sophia would shape dome construction for the next 1,500 years, and engineers still teach the very same principle today. Imagine trying to balance a basketball on top of a cardboard box. The ball touches only a few points. Push it slightly, and it rolls away. That, in essence, was the problem facing every great dome builder for centuries. For hundreds of years, architects had accepted a compromise. They built smaller domes. Or they crowded the room with forests of columns. Or they buried it inside massive walls that blocked all the light. Justinian wanted none of that. He wanted one enormous open hall beneath a single floating dome. To achieve it, Anthemius and Isidore introduced one of the most elegant structural ideas ever created, the pendentive. Look up into the four corners beneath the dome, and you will see giant curved triangular surfaces rising between the arches. Those curved triangles perform an extraordinary task. They gather the weight of the round dome and gradually funnel it down into 4 massive piers at the corners of the square hall. In other words, they turn a circle into a square, not with brute force, with geometry. Yet the mathematicians were not finished. Their second decision looked even more dangerous. Around the very base of the dome, exactly where engineers normally crave the most strength, they cut 40 windows. Think about that. The point under the greatest outward pressure was suddenly filled with openings. To most builders, it would have looked like inviting disaster. But when sunlight poured through those 40 windows, the solid ring beneath the dome dissolved into light. Instead of heavy masonry, visitors saw only a glowing halo. The dome seemed to float effortlessly above the entire building. Ancient writers called it a chain of gold reaching down from heaven. It was not magic. It was one of history's greatest optical illusions, created entirely through engineering. To survive the forces it was playing with, the dome had to be as light as possible. So the builders used unusually thin, light bricks, bonded with thick layers of lime mortar. Every kilogram removed from the crown was a kilogram no longer trying to push the walls apart. But lightening the dome was not enough on its own. A shell this size still pushes outward in every direction, like an invisible weight forever trying to spread its own base apart. The 4 piers could carry the load straight down. Something still had to catch the sideways push. So the builders did something brilliant. On 2 opposite sides of the dome, east and west, they did not raise a solid wall. They placed a second, smaller half-dome. And against each of those half-domes, they nestled smaller curved niches still, called exedra, stepping down and outward like a cascade of frozen waves. Each shell leans against the one above it, catching its thrust and passing it gently to the next. The main dome pushes on the half-domes. The half-domes push on the exedra. The exedra push into the earth. The entire eastern and western ends of the building are not really walls at all. They are a chain of curved surfaces, each one bracing the next, spreading the outward force of the great dome across the whole structure, instead of trapping it in one fragile ring. Everything was carefully balanced, every curve, every brick, every window, every half-dome. For a brief moment, it looked as though the impossible had finally been conquered. But nature had one final calculation of its own, and 20 years later, it would deliver the answer. Designing the dome was only the beginning. Now they had to build it. And everything about the project pushed past the limits of ancient engineering. The dome would rise more than 50 meters above the floor. It would cover an interior larger than anything the Roman world had attempted since the Pantheon. But unlike the Pantheon, Hagia Sophia could not rely on a massive round wall to carry its weight. The Pantheon's dome sits on a solid circular drum, like a lid resting on a barrel. Hagia Sophia's dome would balance on just 4 enormous piers, joined by open arches, with light flooding in on every side. One mistake, one miscalculation, and thousands of tons of brick could come crashing down into the church below. Construction began at astonishing speed. Historical accounts describe thousands of workers split into competing teams, racing one another as the building climbed toward the sky. Inside the unfinished church, scaffolding rose like a forest of timber. Day after day, masons carried bricks higher and higher, laying each course along curves that had never been attempted at this scale. Every angle had to be right. The dome could not simply be stacked. It had to become one continuous, living shell. Meanwhile, Justinian gathered materials from every corner of his empire. Green marble from Greece, purple porphyry from Egypt, white stone cut so that neighboring slabs mirrored one another like the wings of a butterfly. Many of the giant columns had already stood inside older Roman temples. Rather than carve new ones, engineers dragged these enormous monoliths across the Mediterranean and gave them new life inside Hagia Sophia. The empire itself became the quarry. After nearly 6 years of relentless work, the impossible stood complete. In the year 537, Justinian entered his new church for the first time. Looking up at the enormous floating dome, he is said to have whispered one unforgettable sentence: "Solomon, I have surpassed thee." For a moment it seemed he had. The largest enclosed space on earth shimmered beneath its glowing dome. Visitors stood in silence. Many believed no human hands could have made such a place. It appeared that mathematics had finally defeated gravity itself. But buildings do not only negotiate with gravity, they negotiate with time. And before we see how the Earth answered, a quick pause. If you are enjoying this descent into the engineering the ancient world left behind, the kind that still refuses an easy answer, take a second to subscribe. It genuinely helps these forgotten stories reach more people. Because what happens next is the part almost everyone leaves out. Because just 21 years later, time answered back. With an earthquake. For 21 years, Hagia Sophia appeared invincible. Its immense dome floated above Constantinople exactly as its builders had imagined. Pilgrims crossed the empire simply to stand beneath it. Then, in the year 558, the earth began to move. Constantinople sat near one of the most active seismic zones in the world. Earthquakes were nothing new, but this one was different. The violent shaking drove enormous waves of force through the 4 great piers. The arches twisted. Cracks raced through the brickwork. Mortar crumbled under loads it had never been meant to carry. Then the impossible happened. The great dome collapsed. Thousands of bricks crashed into the church below, destroying much of the sanctuary that had amazed the world only 2 decades earlier. For Justinian, now an old man, it was a devastating blow. The monument meant to symbolize the eternal strength of his empire had failed within a single generation. Most rulers would have ordered the dome rebuilt exactly as before. Instead, the Byzantines did something remarkably modern. Before rebuilding anything, they investigated the failure. The task fell to Isidore the Younger, nephew of one of the original designers. And rather than asking how to recreate the lost dome, he asked a far more important question: why had it fallen? The answer was hidden in the geometry. The original dome had been too shallow. Its graceful, low profile looked magnificent, but a flat curve pushes outward with tremendous force, constantly trying to shove the supporting arches and piers apart. Gravity was never the real enemy. Lateral thrust was. Over 21 years, that invisible force had slowly weakened the structure until the earthquake delivered the final blow. So Isidore made a bold decision. He ignored the original design and rebuilt the dome several meters higher. A steeper curve sends far more of its weight downward into the 4 great piers instead of outward into the walls. He also reinforced the shell with structural ribs, channeling the forces along defined paths from the crown to the base. The dome standing today is not the first Hagia Sophia. It is the second answer. A structure redesigned after failure had revealed what mathematics alone could not predict. That may be the building's greatest lesson. Failure was not the end of the project. It was the beginning of a better one. And remarkably, the earthquakes were not finished testing it yet. Rebuilding the dome solved one problem. Surviving the next 15 centuries would prove far harder. The Earth never stopped testing Hagia Sophia. Powerful earthquakes struck again in 989, again in 1346. Countless smaller tremors shook the city in between. Every generation expected the Great Dome to fall once more. It never did. Not because the building had become indestructible, but because it had slowly learned how to survive. Walk around Hagia Sophia today and something immediately stands out. The dome is not perfectly round. The walls do not form a flawless figure. The massive piers lean ever so slightly outward. To an ordinary visitor, these look like flaws. To a structural engineer, they are a logbook. The building has been moving for 1,500 years. Every earthquake shoved it a little. Every repair gently guided it back. Instead of resisting every force, Hagia Sophia slowly adapted to them. Generation after generation, builders strengthened its weak points without changing the soul of the monument. Huge buttresses were added against the outer walls, absorbing the outward thrust that had once destroyed the original dome. When the city became part of the Ottoman Empire, its new rulers did not tear the building down. They protected it. The famous minarets that now frame Hagia Sophia were not only symbols of a new faith. Several of them also act as enormous structural anchors, bracing the corners of the ancient building against future earthquakes. In other words, the monument grew stronger because different civilizations, across 1,000 years, each cared enough to keep it standing. And modern science has uncovered the strangest secret of all. When researchers built computer models and simulated earthquakes shaking the building, they found something counterintuitive. Hagia Sophia does not survive earthquakes because it is rigid. It survives because it is not. The ancient lime mortar between its bricks is softer than modern cement. When seismic waves pass through, that softness lets the bricks shift by tiny amounts, absorbing the earthquake's energy instead of channeling it into a single fatal crack. The same models show the great piers have leaned slowly outward over the centuries, and that the cascade of half-domes and the later buttresses kept catching that movement, again and again, holding them inside the narrow margin where the structure can still stand. Modern earthquake engineering now follows the very same principle. Structures that flex a little survive far better than those that refuse to move. Without any knowledge of seismic science, the Byzantine builders had found that truth through observation, failure, and repeated rebuilding. For 15 centuries, people have searched for a single secret behind Hagia Sophia. A miracle, a lost technology, some hidden formula vanished from history. But the truth is simpler and far more inspiring. Hagia Sophia is not standing because its builders got everything right the first time. It is standing because they were willing to learn when they got something wrong. The first dome collapsed. The second survived. Every earthquake revealed another weakness. Every generation strengthened the building a little more. The Hagia Sophia we admire today is not the work of one brilliant architect. It is the result of 15 centuries of continuous engineering, and perhaps that is the greatest lesson hidden inside its walls. Great engineering is not about creating something perfect. It is about creating something that can keep improving. No single feature performs the miracle. The miracle is the system. The dome distributes its weight through the pendentives. The half-domes swallow the lateral forces. The buttresses catch the outward thrust. The soft mortar absorbs the shaking. One decision bracing the next, like links in an invisible chain stretching across 1,500 years. Ironically, the golden chain imagined by ancient visitors was never hanging from heaven. The real chain was forged by human hands. Geometry, mathematics, experience, failure, repair, and thousands of craftsmen whose names have vanished from history. And that may be Hagia Sophia's greatest gift to modern engineering. Today, we build with steel and software the Byzantines could never have imagined. And still, we design our buildings to last only 50 years, or 100. They built with brick, lime, and patience, and their work has stood for 15 centuries. Not because their materials were stronger, but because they understood something we keep forgetting. Strength is not the absence of failure, it is the ability to adapt after it. The people who changed architectural history were not the ones who never made mistakes. They were the ones brave enough to rebuild after making them. So, the next time you see that great dome floating above Istanbul, remember what is really holding it there. Not a golden chain, not a miracle, but 15 centuries of mathematics, persistence, and people who refused to let gravity have the final word. Which leaves one last question, and I genuinely want your answer. Who is the better engineer? The one with the stronger materials, or the one whose work is still standing 1,000 years after they are gone? Tell me what you think in the comments. And if you love uncovering the forgotten engineering that still shapes the world around us, subscribe and stay for the next story. Because history's greatest structures were never just monuments. They are conversations between human ambition and time itself.